So, here we are, Biomutant. Well, I've been playing the game for a bit now. I have about 12-13 hours in. I am enjoying the game. It's actually quite fun. But I have to say that I did expect a little bit more from it in most aspects of the game. So what do I mean by that? So I remember in the video I talked about my expectations about the game. I said, for example, that I expected the narrator to be quite ingrained in this kind of wacky style that the whole game has. And in this case, the narrator is a bit disappointing because it simply acts as a narrator and doesn't actually have this added value that I expected. So I said in the video that it would potentially have, well, it would crack a bunch of jokes or potentially even break the fourth wall, and in the end it actually does none of it. It does have a kind of funny tone when he talks about it, and because the world is made in this way and it has so many kind of funny names and funny locations and so on, so many characters, that it still has like a comical feel to it, but it's not actively cracking jokes. Then this doesn't really stop here. I feel like most mechanics overall have this kind of lack of complexity. The mobility, for example, has two main things that I'm not too happy about. So the first one is the mounts that you get are basically skins, so you can pretty much mount any animal that you see, any kind of like wild, kind of neutral animal that you can see around, as long as you have like a fruit to kind of tame it. But it doesn't matter which one you have. There's no stats, or no animal is going to be better than anyone. It's just skin changes, but it acts exactly the same way as any other one. So I did expect a bit more to have like the extra complexity like Breath of the Wild has, which is you can tame horses, but then each horse in Breath of the Wild has its own stats. So it really adds that level of I want to find the best horse for me, and in this game really doesn't have that. Another thing about the mobility is that all these like special vehicles that they show that you can actually use seem to be restricted to a specific objective. For example, the mech is purely used. Its sole objective is to travel through one area, which is without air, and it's not something you can build up resistance to. It's just you have to use the mech. That whole area has this mechanic of the lack of air simply to force you to use the mech, and the mech is simply built or made for that area, and it is made to defeat the first boss, which I'll talk about the bosses a bit later. And then the second one that I've unlocked already is the kind of jet ski with like the water vehicle, and that vehicle, well, obviously restricted to water, which is fine. It has some kind of like engine level thing where like certain areas are still locked because I have like the first level of the engine, but maybe if you upgrade it then you can go to those areas as well, which is fine. But it seems like this boat is also designed for the second boss, and I expect then that the other two bosses will kind of behave the same way, where after I defeat the boss, through the story I'll unlock the next special vehicle, and that special vehicle will be designed for a specific region and for that specific boss. So I guess here it also brings me to the story, which, because it is built this way, because you have to defeat the first boss in order to unlock the kind of water vehicle which you can use for the second boss, the whole story seems too directed. Although the story, the overall plot is simple, they kind of wait for that idea of doing each boss in an order and doing each sequence of the game in a specific order, which I don't understand why they went this way. Right, the plot in and of itself is just you have the Tree of Life, and it's being corrupted by these big bosses, right, which you have to defeat each four of them at each corner of the world, and that's basically it. So I expected the game and the story to kind of behave the same way the Breath of the Wild does, so that you have all these bosses that you have to do, which in the case of Breath of the Wild you don't even have to do them. But although I did not necessarily expect that, I did expect that it would allow you to do the bosses in any order and to kind of travel the world in any order you see fit. And it's not really the case. The world is very much made for you to travel it in a certain way. So although you can go anywhere, you won't be able to defeat the boss if you haven't unlocked the special vehicle that you require for it, meaning that you have to defeat the boss prior to it. And then the rest of it is still bound to level. So you'll have areas with low levels and areas with very high level enemies, meaning that even if you go early on, so even if you travel like exploring randomly, you will end up finding places that you can't actually play because you're too low level. So it is a bit of a pity, because the world is quite interesting, and I think it really would have benefited from the idea, like in Breath of the Wild. Again, I am taking a lot of examples from Breath of the Wild, but it does seem like kind of the best equivalent game to some extent. But yeah, it seems like it would have benefited from having this kind of feeling of freedom where you can really just use and go anywhere at any point. And then the mobility, like in the glider, for example, also has the same extra issue, which is actually too simple. So I made a video about what I would like mobility mechanics to feel and be, and this is a clear example of mobility mechanic which is okay, but kind of lacks that extra step, that extra complexity to it. So I have two little issues with the glider. One, in order to deploy the glider, you have to kind of do the double jump, and the second time you press space, hold it, and it will take like half a second to actually deploy, meaning that it's not that accurate on when you cannot predict exactly when the glider is going to deploy, which is a bit of an issue. And then the second thing, it is well, too simple, right? You have to keep holding W. If you don't, the glider will just basically stop in place and start falling, and like start slowly falling. So you don't have really that choice of like diving fast to reach, you know, the ground fast, or like slowly moving in order to reach farther locations, right? So there's only like one way to use it, and then I guess you can turn, but it doesn't really add much to it. So it is too simple. And the combat is quite nice. It is funny enough, the combat looks better than it plays. It plays a bit too stiff, and you find yourself reusing the same abilities over and over. So the way the combat works is, well, you have your simple ranged attack with your gun, whatever, and then you have your melee attack, and then once you gain some points, you're against the levels and so on, you unlock some abilities with it, and you basically unlock 2 abilities with the range and 2 abilities with the melee. And then when you do those abilities, you gain a point on your special ability meter, I guess. And once you have 3 points, then you can do your special ability. And in that special ability, you unlock a few slightly different abilities for a certain amount of time.
Keep your eyes on the end.
Which most of the times I don't end up using it. Usually the special ability allows you to just like spam your ranged attack or spam your melee attack without fearing of getting hit, kind of thing. Which is fine, but that means that you basically end up focusing on a few abilities that are a bit easier. In my case, I find myself using the ranged special abilities constantly in the loop in order to get those special ability points, just to trigger the special ability, which end up becoming a bit of a loop where you end up just doing those abilities, then getting the special, then doing those abilities again, then getting the special, and so on. So then you have your Psi ability, which is another set of abilities that you can actually unlock with the different like attribute points. And those are quite nice because you can have 4 equipped at any time, and you can choose them from a wide range of abilities. And those are kind of like the more like wacky abilities, like the bubble, for example, that they show in the trailers is one of those psi abilities. And these abilities, although they are quite nice, I find myself not using them because of how awkward it is to use them. So in order to use them, basically have to hold an extra key, and then the keys that you usually use for melee or range, or like space or alt, then it allows you to do that new ability. And then they don't, although they are quite useful, they usually don't feel so good, and they don't actually give you that like extra point for your special ability. Meaning that although they're nice, I usually tend to just not use them and focus on my other like range or melee abilities that will actually give me those like special ability points.
That looks like the
but overall, like I mean, the game, the combat was maybe not as good at the beginning. It does get a little bit better as you unlock more abilities and like you improve your your build, I guess.
Nice pants.
But it still lacks a little bit of thing, and it's because all of the abilities kind of auto lock on the enemies, it does feel a little bit too stiff. Maybe it would play. I am playing on keyboard and mouse, and maybe it would play a little bit better on gamepad. So maybe I should try that, I guess. And then the last thing, which is one of the strongest points I think of the game, is the crafting. So the crafting, basically at any point you can go to the crafting menu and select your armor pieces or your weapons and kind of change modifications to them. They change attachments to them. In terms of the armor, it usually simply adds more or less armor to your piece. And for the weapons, it does. You have a bit more choice, and it adds maybe some extra attributes where it might add more critical damage or more critical chance for others. And then you have the ability to full-on craft new weapons, which I think is the most fun thing to do. So throughout the game you loot a bunch of stuff, and most of the time you don't loot full weapons, or you will always loot full armor pieces, although they will always have empty like attachment points. But for the weapons, you usually will only loot pieces of weapons. So you will loot like a gun barrel, and then a handle, and then a grip, and then like a scope, and so on. And then you have to actually craft your weapons yourself. And it is quite nice. You end up usually using like the most stats, but it gives you a lot of variety and a lot of potential for different weapons, which is quite nice. There is a little conflict there where in order to make those weapons you have to use crafting materials, and in order to get those crafting materials you can get them in the wild, exploring and destroying some objects, but overall you get them from scrapping other weapons or other armors. But you could you can also simply sell those weapons in order to get money, I guess. So I'm always in that kind of conflict where I'm not sure if I want to scrap an item instead of like selling it in order to get another item. Although I haven't found myself needing to buy stuff too much, so in the end I do tend to just scrap everything that I'm not going to use. But yeah, like I really enjoy the crafting. It is quite fun, and it really adds that nice level, like nice touch in the selection of the build. So, what is my overall conclusion? So my conclusion,
this is no time for sleep.
I do recommend the game. I think the game is still quite fun. I usually have this rule of thumb, which is by each euro that I spend on a game, I want to spend that same amount of hours on it. And obviously it will depend a bit on the quality of the experience, but in this case I think the rule kind of works. So in that sense, I have played like 13 hours now, and I've paid 60 euros for it. And honestly, I'm not sure if I will end up playing the game for that long. So my end conclusion, I guess, would be that the game is pretty good. I like it, but I would not necessarily recommend it at its full price. So if you want to buy it, if you're thinking about buying it, potentially wait for a sale, like a 20% sale or something, and at that point the game will definitely be worth it. But its current price, I think it's slightly too much. So that was it. Hope you liked the video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
I'm gonna tell you a little story about a boy named Joe.